Shalom.
Shalom, and welcome to Expanding Your Vision. We're going to have another discussion. We're looking into the Torah portion this week, number 10.
Number 10.
Mikeitz at the end, which happens to be at the end of 2 years. Before that, we'd like to dive back a little bit and overlap into last week's portion and include where Joseph, and continue on in his life. He has been in prison, and he comes to a point where these two men are there that have dreams and they don't understand why they've had them, but they're stirred about them and they're trying to figure it out. And he gives them an interpretation that Hashem has given him to give to them, and it comes to pass,
Right.
demonstrating his ability and his connection to Hashem. And as we talked about, it just always rises to the top, his authority. Joseph, no matter where he is, he's in the family, even as the younger brother, he is given the authority of the family to inherit the role of authority and management. In that, he's represented by wearing the coat of many colors
Right.
of fame. And here, even in his slave situation where he's sold into the slavery of the Ishmaelites and ends up at Potiphar's house, he ends up as the manager of Potiphar's house. He then ends up in imprisonment, and there he ends up being given authority and overseeing, and basically, as in all situations, he ends up being the right hand of the supreme authority. And that's going to come to pass a little further as he goes to yet another authority. So here he is, he's given this, and it's demonstrating out of that something about his life that's a prophecy of what's to come. And all these things are charged with a lot of Messianic revelation and portents and prophecy of what will happen. He's given that in this situation and his difficulty, and even as hard as it is for him, he's always brought to a place of, again, authority and raised up for that purpose. And there's something that the Messiah, it's talked about, he says, and he talks about, that he didn't teach without teaching in parable. And so everything he said, and thereby everything he did, because he was always teaching, is a parable. So it's got a literal something, but it has something else that it's trying to say. Much as like when we find out that Joseph is 17 when he has these first dreams, there's something that's alluding to about his character and telling about his future. In this case, we're finding out that it's a prophecy about his character. But in Yeshua, when he says he doesn't do that, there's something to the idea of then overlaying that upon everything. Meaning, even before his coming and living out his life here in walking the land, whatever he did was a parable of what he did. Because he does everything. He feeds with the loaves and the fishes. The prophets had fed with the loaves and the fishes. All these kinds of things were telling of his coming. And he lives them out. The various things Moses did with, again, also multiplying bread was expected of him. So in these ways, we're seeing that in Joseph as a metaphor, as well as his literal life, a metaphor for the Messiah and that life, and what was to come. And so we can look back and see that even his life is a parable of what we can expect. And out of that, we see this, his telling of dreams and visions. So he comes out of that, and it comes to pass. And on the last manifestation of that, he told the cupbearer to remember him, and the cupbearer does not remember him, famously. And it goes on to be 2 years. And now here we are 2 years later that Joseph has remained in there, hopeful for his release and being his reputation restored. And once again, we come to a place of 2 dreams.
2 dreams. Yeah, and some of the sages believe that whenever it says at the end of, how does that start? That it actually is referring to, it's like exactly 2 years later. And some of them believe that this time period is around Yom Kippur.
Interesting.
Because of some
Jubilee,
words like
release.
return, you know, so anyway, so just that's throwing that out there.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I mean, I see a few translations are like at the end of a full 2 years.
Mm-hmm. So full 2 years. So it's exactly to the day.
Yeah.
And it's a time that that the Lord had destined for that. So because, as you say, we're living in the times, and that was no different back then.
Right.
And so he had an appointed time for that.
Right.
So
this week we should be looking for release.
Yes. Let's do it.
Which imprisons us.
Yes. And I think a lesson that we learned from this week's Torah portion as we move forward is Joseph has been exiled, he's been rejected by his brothers, he's been sold into slavery, lied about, thrown into prison. And so these are the things that he faced. Remember, the Lord's given him a dream. He's given him 2 dreams. Right. And he has responded, as from last week, he has responded when the Lord, not just when it's actually his father that was calling him, but I think it was something higher than that.
Yes.
I think he heard it more on a higher spiritual reign. And it was really, because think about this, his father is sending him to look for his brothers in Shechem.
Mm-hmm.
Shechem's not a good, it's not a good place to remember. Mm-hmm. You know, those people were sadly affected by some decisions of the two of the brothers. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, he's really, I think that indicates something. And whenever it says he descended, and I'm not sure that it's in this portion, but whenever we read that they are descending, that means they're going down, but there's about to be a lesson learned. Yeah, and there has to be a descension before there's an ascension. And so that's what, and it says here, indicates that Joseph was a man of sterling character. And I think we mentioned last week about how he was different from when he went into the pit to when he came out. And you can see his character by his promotions, that he does have a sterling character. And it indicates that Joseph recognized that all of his hardships he was going to endure would be preparing him for something. And so I think that would be a lesson for this week, that when we are facing things that are hard and there's difficult times, that the Lord is preparing us for something more. Yeah. And a lot of times too, I think that our attitude determines how long we're going to stay in that pit. You know, so you know, to have Joseph as that character that we need to kind of measure up to, which is also the very character that Yeshua has. And so but he was a man who knew the Lord's purpose, and he did not sway, or he did not get off track. Joseph's named one of his sons Manasseh, which come later, which means God made me forget all of my hardships. Yeah. And so Joseph had another son named Ephraim, which means God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. So Joseph was raised up from a place of, once again, rejection, affliction, prison, but he became a sustainer of life through the Lord. And this too points to the Messiah, who was rejected by his people, and at one point his family as well. And he was put in prison. Yes. And he was afflicted by our sins. And interesting, I heard, and I can't remember the reference, but it talks about Yeshua's death, but I guess in really Hebrew, the Hebrew language, it's actually deaths. And so it's plural.
Yes.
And so that would be my death, your death, Connie's death, Debbie's death, and all of our deaths.
Yes.
That's what he took on for us. So Joseph was embarking on a spiritual repair as he was going through all of these things. And he is seeing, the Lord is seeing where Joseph's heart is. And in every situation that we find ourselves in, it helps us to reckon ourselves and to do teshuvah and to mature.
So true.
So true. Yep.
All these circumstances are set up and guided and put into place just for our perfection.
Yes, and then too, we have to understand that Joseph, whenever this encounter with his brothers, I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit, but this encounter with his brothers is he is recreating the same circumstances that led them to do what they did to him. So now Benjamin became the favored son. Will they do the same thing to Benjamin? Did they learn their lesson? And he is going to give them a second chance to do teshuvah. So he is giving them a do-over.
Amazing. So how does he get there? He's demonstrated his ability to interpret the dreams, and he restores someone to Pharaoh's service, the cupbearer. And again, we get to this set of two dreams. Pharaoh has these two dreams that he doesn't understand. Each dream has a 7 of exception and strength and impression, very impressive, and 7 of weakness and frailty and hardship and fear. So each one has that, and he doesn't know why, and his chief interpreters can't help him out and can't tell him anything about what he's saying. And then the cupbearer hears of this, and he recounts it probably to his little scarcity. He's got to first say, well, Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and he put us in prison. And there we met a young Hebrew slave, and he was able to interpret our dreams. So Joseph is called up from prison and brought forth, and they clean him up and prepare him to be in the audience with Pharaoh. And out of it, he's able to tell Pharaoh what the dreams mean. And Pharaoh is so impressed that when it's seen that there's a need for someone to manage this, and the interpretation, as we see, is that the 7 years of plenty and abundance and success preceding 7 years of famine, which becomes progressively, especially at the end, horrific, exceptionally difficult. And he gives that interpretation, but there's someone needed to oversee the preparation during these, even leading up, but then to manage also the 7 years of success so that the 7 years of failure will be better navigated. So he is then declared to be the second to Pharaoh himself, and Joseph is raised up from that on that day. Right. He's given a new name and a new authority, and his name's Afnaf Paneah, indicating that he sees into the divine. And all this is very telling about what's to happen. Right. So it goes on to talk about that. And Joseph goes on to literally live that out. He oversees the production of the cities, which will have grain and people will bring, and have the storehouses set up, and the whole infrastructure is put into place to do this. And then we get to return to our story of the family. So then we return to Jacob and the sons there.
Right. So, Pharaoh calls Joseph discerning and wise. Mm-hmm. And he's kind of like, can we find a man like this? And he's actually asking if anyone really what he had was the Spirit of the Lord. Mm-hmm. And this is reference to the Ruach HaKodesh.
Yes.
Wisdom and understanding is connected to the Ruach HaKodesh, and they are terms to describe Yeshua, our Messiah. And Isaiah says that the Spirit will rest on him. So Pharaoh then exalts Joseph to his right hand. And so how do we compare that?
The ascension of Messiah, who was made lowly on our behalf. He came in flesh, but even more so suffered, is kind of the epitome of the man of suffering, the suffering servant, and is eventually also, much like Joseph, falsely accused and convicted and sentenced. In Yeshua's case, a death sentence. And but eventually out of that resurrected and ascended and restored unto the right hand of authority.
Right, yeah. And oftentimes I've thought about Paul when he was in prison all of those years. I thought, I wonder if Paul pondered on Joseph in his life. And he seems to have, Paul or Saul was... he was quite the character before coming to the Messiah and that road to Damascus experience. And you can tell in his experience that he's really humbled, and he's really, I believe that he would have reflected on Joseph.
Yes.
Time in prison. And how did I wonder, is there any other writings, not that it's more of just a thought. Is there any other writings that would even maybe talk more of Joseph's time and what he truly did in prison? I'm sure there is somewhere. I'm sure there is somewhere. Because they would have had to, they would have known that. I think Paul would have known a little bit more.
Yeah. About the experience of actually living that out, because even like in this portion, it's 2 years, so that's not even mentioning his previous imprisonment and that. So
some say that he was in prison 10 years before this last 2 years. Yeah, so I couldn't tell you where that is, but I heard that. So.
And as studied as he would probably be aware of some revelation from that and what it meant, and certainly him finding himself in a similar predicament.
Well, even Paul and Silas, singing hymns and praising the Lord and making quite the racket in that prison cell and shaking some stuff up through all that. So, so Joseph and Yeshua both humbled themselves, and then Pharaoh gave a ring to Joseph, which means that Joseph had the authority of Pharaoh's name.
Yes.
And Yeshua has the authority of his father's name.
Yes. Yes.
And so then we also have that whole humbling and bowing down, and the ring. That whole thing is in, of course, the Purim story in the book of Esther. But in Revelation 17:17, it says everyone will bow, and every tongue will confess.
Give honor.
Yes.
Yes. And give honor to the king.
Give honor to the king. That's right.
So we've continued on, and now we're being brought back to Jacob, and because this has been how it affects everybody, this massive impact of plenty and that, and now things are getting thin. We're into the 7 years of drought and famine, and we begin to see how the family of Jacob is affected by it, and they're having concerns about their situation, so they decide they know of this man who you can go and buy, and supplies, wheat and that. So they go down, so the brothers are sent, but Jacob holds one brother back because he can't stand to lose the younger brother of Joseph. So Benjamin is held back, and he stays back in Canaan, and the others go to Egypt.
Right. The funny thing about that is that we think of Benjamin as a child, and we'll read not too later in a couple more chapters. He's got 12 kids. He's got 12 sons. So he's not a child.
So he's not a child, right? His settlement has been developed already. But he's Jacob's baby.
Yeah.
He's Israel's baby. So he's not willing to part with him in that sense. So he sends the other brothers down to pick up supplies for the family and everyone.
Right. And so the fun thing is that they don't recognize Joseph. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes them.
He sure does.
And that's really because he, first of all, is Egyptian, has Egyptian garb on and stuff like that. But then also, remember, he was 17 when they did what they did. So they were all mature men, and a man doesn't lose a lot of his facial. Once he gets to a certain point, that's the face that you've got for the rest of your life.
That's it, going forward.
Right. But Joseph hadn't come into that at his own at that point.
Right.
And so he really, that's one of the reasons, as well as the
right, his look and his accent and his the way he shaved and all his appearance would have been very much Egyptian.
Right.
His name is Egyptian at that point.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and I not to say that the scriptures say this, but I think that Joseph had come into that state of forgiveness towards his brothers already. Because I don't think that he could have been exalted to the places that he was exalted without that forgiveness.
I think the naming of his sons gives you a tip of the hat that he's really moving in that direction.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I agree.
And so if you were Joseph in that situation and you saw these brothers, what would you... Now you have to come from the heart of forgiveness now.
It would have to be the heart of forgiveness.
Yeah.
Well, only knowing the story, I guess, I could only hope I would have gotten to that place as he did.
Right.
And, because he had all authority
right.
to him. And extend that mercy to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
like I mentioned before, he was setting them up in this same scenario.
Yes.
Because it had to be the same. And that's what I've always kind of thought, that when they say, well, we're going to go around this mountain again, in which we have to remember that the Lord was leading B'nai Israel, or the children of Israel. They weren't wandering.
Right.
He was leading them. But there's times that, we do things, and when we fail in a matter, then he is going to bring us back to that place, and we're going to revisit it to see if we can pass this time.
Right.
And that's number one. We have to, so, if you're going through something that's similar to what you just have a different result this time. Yeah. And a lot of it is, and we have to be honest that there is no room for unforgiveness or bitterness in our hearts. We have to forgive. Yeah. That's not an option. Right. It might be a choice for some, but it's not an option for us who believe, because we have to always put into mind what Yeshua did for us, and that in no way compares to what he faced for us.
Right. And it's not always the hardship that it was for Joseph, where it's to be sent ahead, as we'll eventually find out, to provide provision for life for his family and the multitudes as well. Sometimes it may just be for ours or our small households perfection, but those obstacles are there to bring us to that point. And if we decide to get out of that situation by moving or taking a new job or changing schools or some other format change, if we haven't learned the lesson, it's going
to meet us there.
It'll
there waiting.
It'll meet us there. So, and here we are with the brothers, and Joseph is the instrument to bring them around to that test. It's like, have you changed? Are you still the same people harboring the same perspectives you did then?
Right. Yeah. And he had to go through all those things because they had to prove it.
Yes.
And once again, you can see Yehuda or Judah you can see that he's been transformed since that last incident, even with Tamar back in chapter 40.
Yes.
So he's learned his lesson.
Yeah.
He's learned his lesson.
Very much so.
So yeah. So he chooses to put somebody in prison.
It ends up being Simeon.
And why would that be?
So the thought is that it doesn't say specifically, but it does say that the brothers were talking and they didn't think Joseph understood.
Right.
But before that conversation, Joseph says, one of you will stay behind, and the others go home to retrieve your youngest brother, which is Benjamin, back at home with father. But when he comes back after that, suddenly it's Simeon who's staying.
Yeah.
So it seems to be Simeon may have been the one that had the most.
Most invested in that whole thing.
Yes.
But, and just kind of think about it, this is really the first time that Joseph has understood or known what really happened. This is the first time that he's known the fullness of what his brothers did and what really took place at that pit.
Right.
I mean, and so I think that would be a little, that would hit the heart a little bit, I think.
Sure.
But then it would bring a lot of understanding. But then also we've got to understand, we need to get to a point where all of that doesn't matter anymore. That it doesn't matter. God put me here. This is this is the path He's got me on.
Right.
And I often wonder how I even got where I got, even through some of my mistakes. Yeah. If I hadn't made that mistake, I wouldn't be here today, walking in this walk. I mean, I was a believer, but then when I came to the knowledge of the Messianic and stuff, it opened up a whole new avenue. But so I have to apologize for and ask for forgiveness for anybody that I've hurt, in the past, because those were things I just wasn't aware of. But at the same time, I'm thankful for those times as well, because I'm here, I'm where I'm at because of those things.
Yeah, and it's really it's necessary. I mean, we can all fight it and whatever, but it's necessary to make peace with those things as much as we'd like to rewrite things based on hindsight. The sages have a saying that says, "Don't spit in the well you drank from." And while it doesn't mean we have to go back and drink from that same well or replay those same mistakes or frailties that we exhibited in the past, we shouldn't also condemn them or where we're at now because of them. So now we can be wiser. We don't have to, condemn those things, but we can move forward and make peace with them and go forward, knowing that they serve their point of getting us where we're at.
That's right. Well, we're going to move to the Haftarah, but one quick thing that I wanted you to bring up. Now, how many days was Simeon in prison before he sent the others home? Do you know? 3 days.
3 days.
That 3 days comes up a lot, doesn't it?
Resurrection, yes.
3 days, they say that Joseph was in the pit for 3 days.
Yes.
So 2 dreams, all of this it means something. So you're going to go to the Haftarah?
Again, yes, we'll touch on the Haftarah. Again, as we're talking about, a lot of messianically charged prophetical events are happening. But there's a lot of joyous, and again, as we talked about, I think last week, sometimes we don't always know the middle is tough, but we could say it has the likelihood of being it. But when we've been given a direction or what is going to happen, and we're not told how we're going to get there. Well, Joseph was told where he's going, where they're all going to bow down to you. But he didn't know the steps in between where he was at and that occurring and manifesting when that would happen. This is one of those long-term, this is where we're heading. In Zechariah 2, the joyousness and encouragement from knowing that the kingdom will come
Amen.
and be established.
Amen.
And it's the promise. So sing, O daughter of Zion, in Zechariah 2:14. And the full portion is 2:14 through chapter 4, verse 7 of Zechariah. For here I am coming, and I will live among you, says Hashem. When that time comes, many nations will join themselves to Hashem, and they will be my people, and I will live among you. Then you will know that I, the Lord of hosts, who sent me to you, will take possession of Yehuda, of Judah, as his portion in the Holy Land, and he will again make Yerushalayim his choice. So we're looking at this, and there's something that's done. There's a word semak, and this has historically been rendered as a messianic expectation or reference. And the star pattern that's called semak is one star. But when you see the artist's renderings, as you see of many of the constellations, it's always drawn with 5. Because there's 5 references of semak in the scriptures. Semak is the branch. So this one star called semak, it usually again is split into 5 in the pictures. When artists, make a picture of various things, the Big Dipper and the Bear and various other constellations that are out there. So Zechariah has one of these semaks, and it goes on to say, the Lord of hosts says this: if you will walk in my ways, obey my commission, judge my house, and guard my courtyards, then I will give you free access among these who are standing here. Listen, high priest Joshua is the subject of this in Zechariah. Both you and your colleagues seated here before you. And at this point, he's being restored, and it's showing how he's kind of the picture of restoration. He's in filthy rags, and he's in a horrible state. He's been smeared with things you don't want to be smeared with. And his clothes are horrible, but he is going to be lifted up and cleaned off and resurrected unto new life. So both you and your colleagues seated here before you will enjoy that. He goes, because these men are a sign that I am going to bring my servant Semach, the sprout. And one of the 5, each of the 5 of these Semachs has a connection. There's the judge, there's the kingship, divinity. In this case, Semach is a servant, and how it's been overlaid a lot of times is into the writings of the gospel writers and the writer of Revelation. And in this case, the servant Semach is Mark, is seen as referenced. He seems to be bringing out, and there are aspects of the Messiah that are brought out, because wherever Mark talks about in his book, he talks about the things Yeshua is doing as a servant to the people, to his creation. He's not talking about his lineage or his ascension or his kingship, but him as a servant, and that's a big focus of Mark's book. So that is what Zechariah has brought to us out of that, and then Mark is a manifestation of that. In one aspect of the Messiah.
It's so I know this is really a question, and we might not know it. So sometimes, once again, we have more questions than we have answers. And but is Semach somehow have a root or an association with Shamash?
I don't know.
Anyway.
I mean, it could have, looking at the consonants would certainly be a place to start.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, bringing up the Shamash.
Yeah.
So you might wonder why we have our clothing on.
Yeah.
Mine says love, lights, and latkes.
Yeah.
And so
mine is a little bit longer. I think you gotta get in the camera view here. It's deck the halls with matzo balls. A kind of a Hanukkah Pesach reference, but
Yeah. Well, and so the whole thing of it is you've got the dreidels on, and so we have our little. So the reason why we're being so festive here is that we want to just to remind you that Hanukkah starts on Wednesday evening, December the 25th. So you're to eat lots of latkes and sufganiyot and play your dreidel games. And so just to kind of bring up briefly is now Hanukkah and Purim is neither one of them are designated feasts in Leviticus 23. The reason that we celebrate them as children of Jacob in the Tabernacle of Praise is because they're historical events. And in both of those cases, you'll find it in Esther as well as in the book of the Maccabees, which I know is not in the canon, but they are good reading. But they both declare that there's going to be a day of remembrance. And so, that's why we do. But we just have to put it into mind that it is a historical event, much like the United States. We celebrate 4th of July, we celebrate Memorial Day, in all of those days. So that's really just a historical event. Now Daniel 7 through 12 does allude to the Maccabees and their victory. And so it is brought up in the book of Daniel. And so I like to say this too, is that the miracle of oil is not that far-fetched, okay? So, but whether it lasted 8 days or not, I mean, it's just a time to remember, once again, if the Maccabees if Esther hadn't have done what she did, we wouldn't be here. Right. If the Maccabees hadn't done what they did, then we wouldn't be here. Right. And so that's would be the needful reason that we need to celebrate. But just to bring the thought up about the miracle of oils in 1 Kings 17, 8 through 16, there's Elijah and the widow. And if you remember, he goes to her house and he has asked for something to eat. She goes, I only have enough flour, and I'm not telling the story verbatim, so but have enough flour and enough oil to make a cake. Me and my son are going to eat it and we're going to die, okay? And so he says, fix me a cake. And he does. And she does. And so therefore, then this oil and the flour last for quite a while. Yeah. I mean, so it's a miracle of the oil. The second one is in Elisha, because he has to do a same miracle that Elijah did for him to be a prophet, to be considered the prophet. Actually, he has to do double. Right. Okay. Right. So anyway, so Elisha, he goes to a widow's house. It's believed to be the widow of Obadiah. Okay. Scripture's not clear on that, but that's what it's believed to be. And if you remember, he fed some of the prophets when they were in hiding, and apparently he went into debt. And so that's what all this is about. So he says, go and find all the jars that you can, bring them in. And they did. And the oil lasted to fill all of those jars and could pay her out of debt. Right. So once again, whether the Hanukkah menorah lasted 8 days in the oil in those back in the Maccabee days, whether that's a question, but nonetheless we do know that there are two miracle of the multiplication of oil.
Yes, that it already happened.
So we have one more thing too, is that reminder that Debbie, Scott's wife, is a part of our, she is leading our prayer line. And so if you have a need or whatever, even just a praise report that you want us to share, you can go to Expand Your Vision, all one word, Expand Your Vision, at proton.me. Anything else?
Excellent. No, I think prayer is a good place to end.
All right. Blessings.